I can't find an article that lists all of the organisations and august individuals criticising Suella Braverman's illegal immigration bill, so-called illegal immigration bill. I can't find one. And I'm sure there is one, and I don't have a cast of thousands working on this programme, so, maybe if I did, we would have been able to find it. But isn't that significant? Off the top of my head, I know that the United Nations Refugee Council has criticised it in the strongest terms. You know that human rights organisations like Amnesty have. You may not know that the Board of Deputies of British Jews released a statement yesterday saying today's British Jewish community is descended from refugees and/or migrants. We have significant concerns at the potential for newly proposed migration legislation to breach both the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Act. You've got the Children's Commissioner expressing similar concerns, and I can't find it. The News at 10 on the BBC last night led with Gary Lineker's tweet. Listen, if I had encouraged you to vote for Brexit or Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or any of the rest of it, if I bore personal responsibility for the tiny little bit of influence I bring to bear upon listeners every morning, I would probably be desperate to talk about Gary Lineker. But why would the BBC not be putting together a proper collection of criticism from organisations and individuals supremely qualified to do this? Suella Braverman yesterday broke the ministerial code. If she didn't, she can sue me. And she put out an email signed by her attacking the civil service when upholding their impartiality is written down in black and white. She subsequently claimed that it wasn't her. It wasn't me, she said, channeling Shaggy from the, was it about the late 90s? And maybe it wasn't, but it doesn't matter. If your name's on something, then you've got a massive problem in your department and you should resign. You should take responsibility for it. She's resigned before for doing something that broke the ministerial code. Rishi Sunak put her back in the government 9 days later. But let's talk about Gary Lineker's tweet. Sheesh. Front page of a newspaper edited by a man hoping for a knighthood, who's a protege of a man hoping for a peerage, who Boris Johnson wanted to put in charge of Ofcom at around the same time that he succeeded in putting a mate in charge of the BBC. But let's talk about Gary Lineker's tweet. Andrew Neil's still publishing The Spectator, spent years working at the BBC despite publishing actual Nazi apologism. Not just stuff that was not dissimilar to 1930s Germany. He published at least one article that called for the Waffen-SS to be reappraised historically. But let's talk about Gary Lineker's really mild-mannered tweet about language not dissimilar to 1930s Germany. Where do you want to go next? What have we got? Paul Dacre, Ted Verity, Richard Sharp, Robbie Gibb, former Director of Communications at number 10 Downing Street for Theresa May. I'll say that again. A former Director of Communications at 10 Downing Street for Theresa May, now on the board at the BBC, agitating against journalists. Lewis Goodall revealing on the Newsagents podcast yesterday that Gibb made his life hell. But let's talk about Gary Lineker's tweet. Let's talk about Gary Lineker's completely, and let's talk about a sports broadcaster being impartial when you've got Theresa May's former Director of Communications sitting on the bloody board. Let's talk about a sports broadcaster being impartial. You've got a chairman of the BBC who got given the gig after introducing Boris Johnson to a bloke that wanted to lend him £800,000. Let's talk about Gary Lineker, a sports broadcaster, being impartial, and a bloke who edited the Daily Mail when it described High Court judges as enemies of the people and democratically MPs as saboteurs who needed to be crushed, wanted to put him in charge of regulating this industry, in charge of regulating me. But let's talk about a sports broadcaster's Twitter account. Let's not talk about what the Board of Deputies of British Jews have to say, or the United Nations Refugee Council, or the Children's Commissioner, or Amnesty International, or let's not talk about the Human Rights Act, or the Refugee Convention. Let's not talk about why these laws were enshrined in the aftermath of the Second World War and championed by Winston Churchill. Let's not talk about Winston Churchill today. Let's not talk about Winston Churchill until we can pretend that somebody wants to graffiti his statue and that's the end of civilization as we know it. Let's talk about Gary Lineker's Twitter account. except I'm not going to. It might be a mistake, I don't know. I'm not going to today. I'll talk about the bill again when we get a clearer idea of what's actually in it. I will try, and obviously when I point out that I can't find something, I am implicitly asking you to be the production team on the programme. Has anyone because that is almost a topic. How have we ended up living in a country where a truly toxic piece of legislation can be mooted and not one, I bet surely the Guardian have done something. Nobody has actually collated the criticism, despite the fact that it comes from organisations as important as the Board of Deputies of British Jews and the United Nations, the UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Council. It's just going to be us and Belarus soon that aren't signed up to this sort of stuff. Us and Russia. But why isn't it there? Why isn't it there? I don't know. I'm going to talk about some LBC journalism instead of BBC non-journalism today. I'm going to talk about and just to be clear, there are some people at the BBC who are brilliant. They have to endure today not only seeing the Daily Mail lie about them, boiling with rage about Gary Lineker's Twitter account. They're boiling with rage about Gary Lineker, but supremely comfortable about having Boris Johnson's loan facilitator as the chairman of the entire corporation. What do you think is most concerning? A tweet from a sports broadcaster, or cronyism from the chairman, alleged cronyism from yes, well, I'm a normal BBC news journalist and I really care about Gary Lineker, but I'm supremely comfortable with Theresa May's Director of Communications being on the board, agitating against people getting actual jobs, breathing down the neck of actual journalists. That's not a problem at all. But Gary Lineker's Twitter, this is what the Daily Mail is asking you to believe today. And the BBC is populated by management and tragically some journalists, including some household name journalists, who are either in lockstep with this far-right adjacent Brexit ideology. They're either sympathetic to it or they are terrified of poking their head above the parapet. They look at what happens to people like Emily Maitlis when they have the audacity to like a tweet posted by someone like me, to like a tweet, to just press the heart button on a tweet and end up as a news story in the Daily Mail. And the way these people operate, and I'm talking about the newspaper edited by the bloke who's getting a knighthood in Boris Johnson's dishonours list, reportedly, a protégé of the bloke who's getting a peerage in Boris Johnson's dishonours list, reportedly, the same bloke that Boris Johnson tried to put in charge of Ofcom, but couldn't because it would be like putting a fox in charge of a hen house. All of that newspaper there will publish pictures of their homes. Management who've never appeared on screen in their lives. Have a picture of the £1.2 million home where the lefty BBC manager defending Gary Lineker lives. So they won't defend Gary Lineker. They don't want a picture of their front door stuck in the Daily Mail. Neighbours might see it if they're unfortunate to live next door to people who read the rag. So the BBC's cowed. And the path is clear. If you've ever wondered why they were so desperate for the imperial troll Elon Musk to buy Twitter, it was because Twitter lets people who are not disgusting reach big audiences. So does LBC, actually. Hello. But they hate it. They can't control it. So there it is. A 12-minute introduction on why we won't be talking about Gary Lineker today, and a neat explanation of why they are not talking about the Board of Deputies of British Jews or the Children's Commissioner or the Refugee Convention or the Human Rights Act or international human rights organisations. They're talking instead about Gary Lineker's Twitter account. And they're still calling themselves journalists. It's different on a phone-in. I just want to be clear on this occasion. When I come to work in the morning, I look for the most talkable topic that's around, ideally one that is also quite high up on the news agenda. That's very different from what the editors of the News at 10 should be doing. They should be looking for the biggest objective, if you like, or at least an attempt at objectivity, but they're not. The reason why they put the Gary Lineker tweet story at the top of the News at 10 bulletin is because they're terrified of being attacked for not doing it. Do you see? They're terrified of being attacked for not doing it. When Paul Dacre came out and said he thought the BBC had actually covered Brexit pretty well, people should have resigned. My God, Paul Dacre. Paul Dacre thinks we've been balanced on Brexit. A man who wouldn't know balance if it slapped him round the chops. People should have resigned, but they're so terrified of being accused of bias And there are 2 or 3 people in the upper echelons of the broadcasting machine at the BBC who, I think it's fair to say, at the very least, go along with propaganda and appalling journalism, and that is quite a charge. There are a few people in the upper echelons at the BBC who go along with it to the point, I think, of actually facilitating and amplifying it, because they know that if they don't, they'll end up being treated like Emily Maitlis, or indeed being attacked by the Daily Mail. So whether or not they are colluding or merely cowardly, I'm not entirely sure. But they are either colluding or cowardly. That's quite a charge. So that's why we won't be talking about Gary Lineker today.